There is an age-old legend that somewhere in these forgotten wastelands lie the fabled Solomon's mines. The Bible states that Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 636 talents of gold. In modern terms, that means 13.5 tons. The Bible also lists great quantities of other valuables. Where did they come from? Where did his caravans travel to find his fabled mines? What was the source of Solomon's great wealth?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
For centuries, the Israelites had been nomads. From the time they left Egypt, they had no land to call their own. King David, according to the Bible, brought them a dream, a city of their own, Jerusalem. Having at last won his kingdom, David felt his own hands were too stained with blood to be the builder of God's house. So he abdicated to his favored son, Solomon. Here in the spring of Siloam, outside the walls of Jerusalem, Solomon was anointed king. The first temple was built by Solomon, and it made Jerusalem the center of the Jewish religion for all time. It was Solomon who transformed Jerusalem into an ancient wonder. Today, it's the center of 3 great religions. For Christians, it's the scene of the crucifixion. For Muslims, it's the place where Mohammed climbed to heaven. And for Jews, the Wailing Wall has special significance because it is all that remains of the Western Wall, the site of Solomon's temple. Solomon had to secure and develop the territories David had won. It was the largest land empire in the Near East. By defeating the Philistines, the Israelites created a kingdom which stretched from Beersheba in the south to Dan in the north. Caravan trails crossed the kingdom from north to south and east to west. Solomon found himself controlling the crossroads of trade for the civilized world, and so was able to command a steady income in tolls for safe passage. Solomon built 6 mighty fortresses which secured the main trade routes of the Middle East. To the northeast, stretching along what is now the Lebanese coast, were the kingdoms of Phoenicia. The Phoenicians had great resources of timber and metal, and skill in working them. What they lacked were agricultural products. To compensate, the Phoenicians turned to trade. Solomon had an abundance of grain. The Phoenicians were a great maritime power. Their alliance with Solomon would make him the richest merchant prince in the world. In exchange for grain, Phoenicians sailed the oceans and traveled to the limits of the known world and beyond, seeking trade goods. Solomon's harbors assumed a new importance. They would become bases for a Phoenician sea trade and provide homes for Phoenician skills and technology. sent 10,000 men to cut the cedars of Lebanon, timber for his great building projects and for his new shipyards. And even today, the remains of slipways still run down to the sea. Phoenicians built and manned the ships. Not just vessels to ply the coastal trade, but ships which could go on a 3-year voyage to the land of Tarshish. The Israelites were, by tradition, a nation of nomadic farmers, and without his Phoenician allies, Solomon could have achieved none of his greatness. This ship's stove, like all Phoenician work, was of distinctive design. Phoenician style became the Art Nouveau of Solomon's kingdom, using techniques which became traditional and have changed little since. Metalworking, too, was virtually a Phoenician monopoly. They had the skills for making not only the necessities of life, but for working rare metals as well. The metal arrived already refined in ingots. Along with the cargoes of precious metals, the ships brought apes and peacocks and ivory. Their skill at working with gold keystoned the craft of the Phoenicians and creates the mystery. Where did Solomon's gold come from?
The answer to the question may be found in the extraordinary relationship that developed between the Israelites and the Phoenicians. Each had what the other needed. To find Solomon's mines, it's important to understand the trade between the two nations.
The Phoenicians opened up to Solomon the trade routes of the world. In return, Solomon guaranteed them a regular supply of oil and wheat. This agricultural surplus gave him his purchasing power and was the real basis of his wealth. A sledge with stones bedded in its bottom is still used for threshing on remote Bedouin farms. The wheat is spread on the threshing floor, and the continual circulation of the sledge gradually separates the grain. It is a timeless method common throughout the Near East, and is probably not so different to methods in use at the time of Solomon. Tossing the wheat in the air separates the chaff, which is blown away in the wind. It is then winnowed before being ground in a stone quern. The grain is poured into the center of the quern and emerges as flour for the baker. Agricultural produce was brought in to be stored in great warehouses and granaries. For 1 month in the year, each of the 12 provinces had to feed the capital. These new cities were built under the supervision of Phoenician craftsmen. Theirs were the skills which crafted the masonry, walls, and staircases, cutting the stone into accurate geometric blocks. This doorway, with its decorated capitals, is typical of Solomon's style of architecture. Their greatest work, however, was the building of Solomon's New Jerusalem, where the workmen were personally supervised by the Phoenician king. The stone was quarried locally, and the city was transformed from a small fortress town into one of the wonders of the ancient world. Deep under the present city lie the remains of Solomon's buildings. Solomon's palace once stood here, and the walled-up arches of the Golden Gate are on the site of the entrance to the temple. The layout was similar to a much smaller temple found at Arad, near the Dead Sea. At one end was the Holy of Holies, and in the center of Jerusalem was the sacrificial altar. Quoted from the Bible, 3 times in a year did Solomon offer burnt offerings and peace offerings upon the altar which he built unto the Lord. Solomon's temple was furnished in gold, and gold leaf decorated the richly carved cedar paneling. The fame of his magnificence spread far beyond the frontiers of Solomon's own kingdom, and the great of the world came to see for themselves and wonder. Ezekiel refers to silver, iron, tin, and lead coming from Tarshish. These metals with gold could come from Spain. The ivory, apes, peacocks, and additional gold could have been shipped from North Africa. Such a voyage might well have taken 3 years. Solomon struck a deal with the Phoenician king Hiram. In view of the success of their joint operations in the Mediterranean, they agreed that together they would open up new trade routes to the south in the Red Sea. The Bible tells us that a joint fleet was built at Etzion-Geber. Was this the port from which the Phoenician gold ships sailed? A world-renowned metallurgist undertook archaeological excavations. Professor Rothenberg.
This would not be a possible site for a port. You wouldn't possibly be able to build a ship there. The winds are so strong, the south winds are devastating. It's the worst place in the world to look for a port. The only site I can see is a small island called Jasirat Pharaon, the Coral Island, south of Eilat, which has a natural port, a beautiful anchorage. Even in the biggest storm, it will be quiet in that small bay. It's the only natural port, and I'm sure this is the site.
Here, excavations unearthed warehouses and workshops. Were the remains of caulking pitch and tar, which were found beside the small fortified harbor used on Solomon's new fleet? The whole island was enclosed in a fortified wall, part of which still exists at the base of later fortifications. This new port would open up a whole new hemisphere. It would challenge the land routes across Arabia. Eventually, the Phoenicians would reach India and circumnavigate Africa. Could Solomon's mines have been in one of these new and distant lands? The existence of Solomon's sea trade brought strength and wealth to his land. It also brought the most famous woman of the time to him with a sense of need and humility. The Queen of Sheba came from southern Arabia, the wealthiest region of the Semitic world. She brought gold, supposedly from her mines, frankincense and myrrh from deserts in her kingdom, and spices and other goods derived from her trades in India.
Solomon, with his Phoenician ships, obviously disturbed very much the overland route. And as they were after the same raw materials and after the same trading partners, the obvious thing to do was to make a common enterprise. And so the lady came up to talk to the king, and he was clever enough, in this case, to say, okay, let's do it together.
She had arrived with a great train of camels. The camel had only recently been domesticated. It had opened up the possibilities of trade across the waterless desert. So it seems they concluded their trade treaty. In return, Israel would have provided her with agricultural produce and manufactured products of third countries like Phoenicia. The queen was certainly impressed by what she had seen. Thy prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. Silver was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon. Everything at his court was made of gold. But where did it all come from? While the queen was in Jerusalem, another cargo of gold and precious stones arrived from Solomon's port in the Red Sea. This jar was labeled Gold of Ophir. Ophir certainly existed, and it has fascinated biblical scholars for centuries. Where was it? Was it in the East? In Africa? Even America? Modern Israelis called this new town Ophira because they believe that Solomon's mines are somewhere nearby in the mountains of southern Sinai. The landscape is littered with the debris of recent war, but there is no trace of Solomon's mine. Merchants traveling north from the Red Sea towards Jerusalem may have left a clue. En route, they sought shelter from the heat of the day in the shade of a canyon. As they whiled away the hours, they sometimes carved their names on the rocks. And once someone carved a Phoenician ship. This is a much larger and more seaworthy vessel than the small inshore craft which plied the Mediterranean coast. These could have been the ships that sailed the Arabian coast in search of gold. From the size and number of amphora jars they carried, we conclude that these ships were large and strong enough to sustain long voyages. The Red Sea is full of coral reefs and sudden winds. It is a graveyard of ships. And even today, the local fishermen cast their nets in the shallows rather than venture upon the waters. To avoid the monsoons, the ships would have to leave in July and return in December. So, exactly where did these ships travel? Where was Ophir?
What actually is hidden in the deserts of Arabia? We have now geological reports mentioning hundreds of mines, gold, silver, and copper, along the western side of Arabia, where a lot of ancient remains have been found, traces of metal making. And I think we should consider this as one of the major centers of early metallurgy in the Near East or in the ancient world, which so far had not been recognized. So, with increased knowledge, our ideas change.
In the desolate mountains of the Sinai lie the great mines of Timnah. For decades, they have been called Solomon's mines. But are they? The possibility of locating the mines long excited archaeologists.
Timnah was untouched. All we had to do is to kind of dust it. Very shallow excavations, and here you had complete factories standing with all the remains, working tools, the pottery, and the furnaces. So it's a unique site in the world. The earliest mining operations we have are from the 4th millennium BC, the very beginning of copper making, the end of the Stone Age. Then again we have the large workings, thousands of mine shafts, actually date to the time of the New Kingdom of Egypt, roughly the time of the Exodus.
In this small temple, the Egyptian landlords and their Midianite workers worshipped the goddess Hathor. The artifacts found by Rothenberg were made by Midianites from Arabia, famed for their skill in metal making. They were made over a period of about 150 years. Then, quite suddenly, mining stopped.
I think it was abandoned mainly because the energy problem became too complicated. They had chopped down all the trees. They must have carried charcoal from great distances. But we should, of course, take in consideration that in the middle of the 12th century, the Egyptian empire collapsed. The Egyptians retreated into Egypt, left the Asian provinces. We have not found any remains whatsoever that could be collected to Israel. There are no traces whatsoever of King Solomon or any other Israelite king in the area. The mines were mined out already long before and have never been worked since. And we know from the Bible that the Midianites, or the Canaanites, as they were called in Midianite family groups, were the earliest metallurgists. But we have no traces whatsoever of any metallurgy in Israel, in the sources or in the towns excavated.
In Arabia, today's gold is black, the rich oil found there. Perhaps this area was also once the origin of Solomon's gold. Did Solomon ever have his own mines, or did he simply trade with people that did? After his death, his kingdom fragmented, and his ships rotted on the shore. Solomon's trading partnership with the Phoenicians had made him the richest man in the world. The magnificence of his wealth was never to be seen again in Israel. Historians who wrote about it long after his death made it a legend in its own right. Where it came from was forgotten. All that was left was a memory of untarnished glory. The sun had set on the greatest maritime adventure of the ancient world.